Welcome, everybody, to the Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen Center for Thought and Culture. I'm David DeSerto, Interim Executive Director here, and we're just delighted that you chose to spend such a nice, warm Friday evening with us here, particularly because we have Mary Eberstadt here with us tonight, who will be speaking on her newest book, Primal Screams, How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. Copies are available or will be available in the back for purchase and for signing after tonight's event. And just want a few thank yous before we get started. First of all, I want to thank my colleague Joe Kimple and his team for this is actually one of the first events we've had in our new studio theater, and they've made it look so spectacular. They're the hardest working people here, so I just want to thank him. And you can find out about all our events, both in theater, music, film, and talk at sheencenter.org. We'd like to extend also our sincerest gratitude to our friends at the National Review Institute for partnering with us on tonight's event and other events we've had here, in particular to Kathryn Jean Lopez, who will be joining Mary on stage after Mary speaks. I got to start getting Kathryn on the payroll here. She's been such a huge help to us. In addition to this book, Mary has authored numerous other titles, including It's Dangerous to Believe and How the West Really Lost God. And she serves as a senior research fellow at the Faith and Reason Institute in Washington, D.C. Now, I noticed in one of the early pages here, she includes a quote from the eminent neurologist Oliver Sacks. Quote, "If a man has lost a leg or an eye, he knows he has lost a leg or an eye. But if he has lost a self, himself, he cannot know it because he is no longer there to know it." It reminded me of Chesterton's famous line that man has always lost his way. He has been a tramp since Eden, but he knew or thought he knew what he was looking for. For the first time in history, man begins to really doubt the object of his wanderings on earth. He always lost his way, but now he has lost his address. Here, hopefully, to help us re-find ourselves, our home, and our address, is Mary Eberstadt.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thanks to the Sheen Center and to National Review Institute for having me here tonight. It's a great honor to be here, and I'm especially honored that you came out on this formidable evening. So thank you. I'd like to start tonight with a little thought experiment. If we step outside the 24/7 news cycle and survey our society from above, what particular features might we see? Features that distinguish us from the generations that have gone before. Well, one such signature development amounts to a remarkable fact. We live in a time when a great many people are struggling to answer the most basic human question: who am I? Identities of all kinds have proliferated: ethnic identities, gender identities, feminist and other political identities, and so on. In Primal Screams, I'm asking why. How did it come to pass that, unlike the people who came before us, literate or illiterate, so many of us today don't seem to know who we are until we answer that question by way of attachment to some political collective? So I wanted to address that unique confusion of our time and to try and understand what's really driving it. Primal Screams, in some ways, is the flip side of a previous book called How the West Really Lost God, published in 2013. How the West Really Lost God asked a similar question. How had it come to pass that, unlike the generations before us, ours has increasingly been turning its back on God and falling away from organized religion? How the West Really Lost God argued that, contrary to conventional accounts of Christian decline, the contemporary emptying of the churches is due to post-1960s social transformations. These transformations, I argued, had interrupted the learning belt, the transmission belt of religion itself. This thesis was countercultural in the sense that it advanced a new theory of how and why societies secularize. But as that book argued, and as the years since continue to confirm, evidence abounds that the decline of the churches and the decline of family and extended family are tightly linked. So the present book, Primal Screams, looks at a different part of the big post-revolutionary picture, politics. It argues that questions of identity and identity politics have become central to American political life. The book asks why this has happened and proposes an answer that is not like those that have come before. Now, many voices, both supportive and opposed to identity politics, have discussed what this new code of conduct is doing to us. My book asks a different question, which is what the obsession with identity is telling us about ourselves, our society, and our civilization, excuse me, and how our radical new way of living is transforming all of the above. My purpose is not to excoriate identity politics, as many writers left and right already have done. It is rather to try and explain why so many people seem to have lost their very selves, with the result that Western politics and societies now resound with languages of loss, fury, and rancor. So here is one set of facts that links today's confusion about identity to the decline of the family. In part, it is simple arithmetic. Think of all the post-revolutionary phenomena that are now ordinary facts of life. Abortion, fatherlessness, divorce, single parenthood, childlessness, the shrinking family, the shrinking extended family. Every one of these developments amounts to an act of subtraction. Every one of them reduces the number of people in our lives that we can call our own. And since we are relational creatures, social animals, the result is a great vacuum. Primal Screams argued that the increasingly panicked flight to collective identities is an attempt to fill that vacuum. Now, as I try to emphasize in the book, the focus of the argument is not on any single one of these acts of choice. It isn't about the moral content of those decisions, even. Instead, Primal Screams is about the collective environmental impact of many millions of such instantiations of autonomy taken over the course of the past 50-plus years. Considered together, I argue, these phenomena amount to a massive perturbation of the human ecosystem. They do not affect everyone equally. There isn't some magic one-to-one correspondence suggesting that if you live with any or all of these phenomena, you are therefore correspondingly vulnerable to the adverse trends described in the book. This isn't about individuals, but the collective environment. And just as a factory dumping toxins into a lake will affect some fish more than others for reasons scientists don't understand, so it is here. This is about how all of these acts taken together have reduced the gravitational pull of yesterday's identities, with the result that many people now only can find their identities in politics. So, second, the timeline bears out the connection between identity politics and family implosion. To study it is to see that identity politics has grown in tandem with the spread of the sexual revolution, And not only in the United States, but across every society rooted in Western civilization. In these post-revolutionary societies, the old ways of knowing who I am and what I'm for are growing weaker for many people and no longer exist for some. Now, let me mention some predecessors to this argument. In his landmark 2000 book, Bowling Alone, political scientist Robert D. Putnam mapped the dislocations of declining declining communities and associations. So his was one kind of empirical guide to just how radically life has changed. After all, that question, who am I, could be answered by reference to one's bowling league, or one's role as a scout leader, or other forms of civic engagement, at least answered in part. And to some extent, of course, the question can still be answered in these ways, but as Putnam showed almost 20 years ago, to a much lesser extent than before. The same is true of religion, as I argued in How the West Really Lost God. For most people coming before us, that question, who am I, had at least one potentially simple answer. I am a child of God. I am first and foremost a child of God. That's at least the Christian answer to the question of my identity, not my sex, not my gender, not my skin color, not any of the other particulars about me. And for believing Christians, of course, that is still the answer to the question, who am I? But with the decline of Christianity across the Western world, many people can no longer answer that question, who am I, by reference to a transcendental realm. And then, of course, there is the other obvious way of answering the question, who am I? That is by reference to my role in a familial order. I am a mother, I am a cousin, I am an aunt, and so on. Again, what we need to understand is that outside of wartime or other catastrophe, the organic connections of this unit have been sundered as never before. Vague talk of family change, like you see in contemporary sociology, does not do justice to the magnitude of this change. Empirical evidence, such as that's presented in chapter 2 of the book, makes a start. To summarize just a little of that evidence quickly, system-wide familial dislocations are now having repercussions at every stage of human life. And they are adverse repercussions. On the one hand, we have new data about the steep rise in psychiatric problems among American teenagers and young adults. And as some may have seen, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a new study indicating that teenage suicide is spiking. On the other end of the life cycle are the loneliness studies that are now proliferating in sociology, spotlighting the increasing isolation of the elderly in every Western nation. There's a lot more that could be said about those trends, but the point is that we are surrounded by empirical evidence that something about the way we are living has run amok. Psychiatric problems are rising. Life expectancy is falling in the United States for the first time in recorded history. And as we all know, many people in public life are at each other's throats. There is also new evidence that loneliness has exploded not only among the elderly, but increasingly among the young. And of course, there is the multiplying confusion of all sorts related to gender identity, ethnic identity, and much more. Now, Primal Screams does not make a monocausal argument about these things. There are other social changes that contribute to our confusion and division, and I tried to analyze those as well. The internet and globalization being the two most obvious candidates. But for reasons elaborated in the book, I believe the prime mover here is, again, the uniquely atomized post-revolutionary
social and familial order. Now, as compelling as it is, social science isn't the only way of showing that the fractured post-1960s order has been raising fundamental questions of identity for a long time now. Pop culture weighs in here too. So I would like to mention here another set of evidence linking identity loss to family loss. 15 years ago, in an essay called Eminem is Right, published in Policy Review, I documented at 6,000 words length, which you can't do anymore in a magazine, something that seemed and still seems to be a seminal fact. Family rupture, family anarchy, and family breakup had become the signature themes of Generation X and Generation Y popular music. I would like to quote a paragraph summarizing this. If yesterday's rock was the music of abandon, today's is that of abandonment. The odd truth about contemporary music, the characteristic that most separates it from what has gone before, is its compulsive insistence on the damage wrought by broken homes, family dysfunction, checked out parents, and absent fathers. Papa Roach, Everclear, Blink-182, Good Charlotte, Eddie Vedder, and Pearl Jam, Kurt Cobain and Nirvana, Tupac Shakur, Snoop Doggy Dogg, and above all, Eminem. These and other singers and bands, all of them award-winning top 40 performers, have their own generational answer to what ails the modern teenager. And surprising though it may be, that answer is dysfunctional childhood. To put the point another way, during the same years in which progressive-minded, politically correct adults were excoriating Ozzy and Harriet as artifacts of 1950s oppression, many millions of American teenagers were enshrining a new generation of music idols whose shared signature in song after song is to rage about what not having had a nuclear family did to them. End of quote. Now, back then, in the 1990s and early 2000s, identity politics was not yet the omnipresent headline that it is today. But even so, the effect of family decline on the sense of self was already being writ large across this music. A lot of it is about rage at the status quo, about wanting to be somewhere else, about fury at adults who play revolving roles in children's lives. And a lot of it was also about wanting to be someone else. In other words, a lot of popular music in the decades leading up to today's identity politics was already about a cratering sense of identity on the part of many kids. And above all, there is the fiery emotional connection that generations of teenagers have found in bad boy rap superstar Eminem, who is the Greek chorus of family dysfunction. So, again, long before today's identity panics on campuses and elsewhere, a lot of young America was already stumbling over the question, who am I? Just listening to what they were driving up the charts proved that point. There is, I hope, a lot more evidence in the book, but in conclusion, I'm trying in Primal Screams to shine a light on something that has not been adequately addressed, either by liberals and progressives who embrace identity politics, or by conservatives who disdain identity politics. That is the primordial panic underlying this phenomenon and the origins of that panic. Unlike other critics, I believe there is suffering among the adherents of identity politics, lots of suffering. The trauma is real, but the origins aren't correctly diagnosed. Just think about what controversial speakers on campuses encounter these days on the part of identitarians. Screams, monosyllabic chants, students with duct tape mouths, threatened and sometimes real violence. These are not civil rights or anti-war demonstrations of yesteryear. They are outbreaks of serious group irrationalism and emotivism. So what is to be done? I don't have the blueprint, but I do have a few thoughts about how to get there. First, as with any malady, we can't get better until we have the right diagnosis. If we think the problem behind our riven politics is some abstraction like the patriarchy or the gender binary, as many people do think, we will not come up with a fix for our divisions. We have first to understand their true origins. Second, I hope that conservatives and other critics of identity politics might come away from this book with a more empathetic understanding of where our national divisiveness is really coming from. There is a lot of collective anguish lurking under all of the electronic flame-throwing, bizarre behavior on campus, and other manifestations of social unraveling. As for the liberal left side of the political spectrum, I hope readers will understand that this book is an attempt to get at identity politics from the ground up, that it takes such politics seriously, even if the book's analysis will challenge common suppositions. It is also to be hoped that some readers of the left might rethink their wholesale embrace of sexual autonomy. Within living memory, there were men and women of the left who did just that. Among them, Christopher Lasch and other writers cited in the book. Columbia University Mark Lilla is among the commentators to this book, and although he disagrees with much of its thesis, he does engage it respectfully and with civility. So do the other contributors, Rod Dreher and Peter Thiel. We all hoped to set an example about what agreeing to disagree might look like again, and to open a conversation where none yet exists. Finally, I would like to mention that there is also take-home here for Catholics about Catholic teaching. And this is directed at those who often feel beleaguered in the public square these days. Troubled though it is, out of fashion though it may be, the Catholic Church, in retrospect, got a very big thing right here and has from the very beginning. Let me explain by way of example. 25 years ago, the brilliant scholar Leon Kass wrote a meditation for Commentary magazine about the hidden beauty and logic of the dietary laws of Judaism. He observed that in ways that couldn't be known at the time, those laws protected God's people from physical harms, including some that would not even have names until millennia later, after germ theory, when science would uncover them. As Kass observed, quote, "These remarkable customs not only restrain and thwart the bad, they also commemorate the true and beckon to the good. The dietary laws of Leviticus commemorate the creation and the Creator and beckon us toward holiness," unquote. So, as a friendly amendment, and omitting that word dietary, I believe that certain other laws that would prove demanding and difficult were handed down from the earliest days of Christianity. These laws and rules were among the features that set Christians apart. But they also protected the followers of Christ in a way that couldn't have been as obvious at the time, by giving them an unseen shelter in which the social animals that are human beings could flourish. That shelter, that familial refuge, is what we need to recover. So in the end, as noted in the book, discussion of today's crisis over identity is really more about anthropology than it is about politics. Since the sexual revolution, we have been bearers of a false anthropology that overestimates
our solitary selves and underestimates our need for one another in the most elemental of ways. That's why I wrote this book and other books. That false anthropology is what Primal Screams is trying to change. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. There's so much that we can talk about. I want to start by just saying thank you. Because the thing about your books that are different than a lot of intellectual books is they have such a heart to them because you're listening to people, you're looking at people, you're seeing what's happening and you're responding to that with the intellectual arguments, but almost issuing a plea. I felt this way about It's Dangerous to Believe, your previous, most recent previous book. I guess the last homily was right before that, but anyway, so much to talk about. It's not rhetoric, political rhetoric that you're trying to, or red meat, or it's exactly the approach as you suggested was the goal, to show people how to have an argument that doesn't add salt to open wounds, right? Because so much of our politics does exactly that. And so why is it so important for you to take that approach?
Well, I think a lot of things about our moment are not well understood, but one of them is that we are seeing political manifestations of primordial passions and primordial needs. And that's why, again, I don't think our problem is primarily political. We are in a novel situation where politics is having to deal with phenomena that are essentially pre-rational. And I think that is a new problem for the United States. And my hope is that by calling attention to the pathos that is beneath this, we can elicit both a shock of recognition on the part of the people who have that pathos and a shock of understanding on the part of those who dismiss all of that as just the doings of snowflakes and weak-kneed progressives and so on.
You talk about the great scattering. Is that the reason that we're at this point where people bipartisanly are looking for from politics things politics can't give them?
Yes, and that's a phrase that I use in the book, and I alluded to it slightly in going through what I argue are these acts of subtraction in our lives, subtracting the number of figures to whom we are related, who we can call our own, on whom we can count. And I don't think this has been well understood, but I'm talking about things like, for example, a headline in National Geographic a little while ago asking whether middle children were going extinct because the family has shrunk, because there are more and more only children, not only in the United States. The singleton family is now the norm across Western Europe, for example. And then you add in all of the siblings subtracted, the potential siblings subtracted by abortion, the absence of fathers in almost half of American homes, and so on. This all matters for a lot of reasons, and they aren't all ooey-gooey emotional reasons. As I talk about in the book, we are, like other animals, social learners, and that is to say we learn from those around us. It might seem like an obvious point, but I don't think it's obvious to most of us. We learn beginning from the time we're very young by watching those around us, just as bats learn how to be bats by watching their bat families. Now, what happens in a world where the family has become as truncated as it has across the West? Part of what happens is that that kind of learning has been interrupted, just as analogously religious learning has been interrupted by the same trends. And so when I talk about the great scattering, capital G, capital S, that's what I'm referring to, the way that people who have been designed, for want of a better word, by evolution or God or however you want to put it, to live as social creatures in a tightly bonded
community, usually of biological relations. What does it mean that they've been scattered out there and don't have that anymore? I think it means a lot of adverse things that social science continues to document, and I think we need to connect those dots.
You talked to me as you were writing this book about your whole approach. And I remember being a little worried when you talked about the animals, because I grew up in an apartment in New York City. We didn't have animals, so I didn't know if I could relate, but I was able to understand. But why was it so important for you to include that unusual element?
Kathryn is afraid of our dog, and our dog is a runt sheltie. So when Kathryn says she has an animal issue, it really speaks to me because I know it from experience.
I didn't mean to be bad honest. It's so true.
We call it transparency when we're embarrassing our friends. Sorry. No, that
And it seems like people are enjoying it, so well done.
Wow. So to the serious point, during the last decade especially, there has been an explosion of information about the workings of animals, the other animals. And this is with the use of MRI technology and all kinds of other stuff that we didn't have before. And what all of this has revealed is something that is, I think, shocking to many people, which is animal life is intensely familial. I open the book with the story of the lone wolf, because the story of the lone wolf is a myth. There's no such thing as a lone wolf. Wolves live in Ozzie and Harriet style families, mom, dad, pups. So do coyotes, so do many other animals, and not only mammals. The more science studies animals, the more scientists understand that the social nature of animals begins in family life. And again, this is true across the animal kingdom, and there are many examples in the book. In the book, I don't use these examples to prove the point, but just to illustrate, emphasize, underline what I'm trying to talk about. But just to offer one, elephants, for example, stay within 15 feet of their mothers for the first 8 years of life. And there are lots of other instances from the elephant world especially of how tightly knit these animals are to their families. And in fact, that understanding is one reason why there's such concern about elephants, because now it's known that disrupting their families destroys these animals. So in the book, I try to get at this by pointing out that if we're talking about elephants, there's a lot of concern, especially on the left side of the political spectrum, about what it means to separate them from their families and how that causes rampaging behavior and other kinds of elephant dysfunction. We need to turn that mirror on ourselves to understand ourselves properly. And the interesting thing is we have this observer bias where we can see it in all of these other animals. We can see why it's pathetic to deprive rhesus monkeys of their rhesus monkey mothers, for instance. But we don't turn that understanding on ourselves. And so underneath the argument of the surface of the book, there is this, I hope, subterranean insistence going on that we connect these other dots about what science is showing us about social creatures.
Can we turn the mirror on ourselves, though? Because there are so many implications to that, right? And we live at this time where you have to tolerate everything, but not tolerate actually more traditional views, which may lead you to the conclusion, like you come to, that things like, Humanae Vitae was right, that kind of thing, but not saying it in a triumphalist kind of way, but saying, wait, can we take a few steps back here? Because people are hurting, and we need to rethink this. Can the sexual revolution be rethought? Can this actually happen?
So that's an argument about rollback, and I would argue that rollback has already begun, and its beginnings can be seen in the fact that the younger generation of Americans is more pro-life, sometimes considerably more pro-life, than their parents. That's a remarkable fact, and I think that is the beginning
just the beginning of using science to understand ourselves and to try and understand what's right and what's wrong out there, because that's obviously what's happened in the change of opinion about abortion among younger people. And I would like to apply that kind of insight more widely to understanding our situation. And I think it's really past due. In reciting these dry-seeming statistics about suicide, depression, anxiety, etc., I'm not trying to be Debbie Downer and pile this stuff on. I think we are at a turning point as a civilization. We have to take account of this. We have to take account of the fact that 400,000 people died in the opioid epidemic. And that's to say nothing of what's happened with their families and the sort of, generations of rupture that are going on there. There are, of course, a lot of theories about the opioid epidemic, and, courtrooms are delivering blame and punishment, and that's all to the good. But at some point, we also have to ask ourselves, why are so many people prone to this in the first place? There is something really wrong out there, and perfectly secular social science continues to measure it and continues to put the data out. I do think that eventually, like the data about smoking tobacco, it's going to change some hearts and minds. And that, again, is why I did not only this book, but the other books.
You mentioned transparency before. In many ways, you're just speaking the obvious, right? Out loud, that people need to face.
I don't think it's obvious because, of course, the denial is so
Right.
deep, right? We've had since the 1960s to mess ourselves up in this way, and we've done a really good job of it. The sexual revolution has been the biggest party humanity ever threw for itself. And now we're at the point in the party where it's 2 a.m. and everybody knows there's catastrophe, and nobody wants to call the cops, and nobody wants to admit that maybe they shouldn't have thrown the party. But, as of MeToo, I think we are, again, moving closer to a reckoning, at least among the people who are still rational enough to discuss these things, wherever they might be on the political spectrum. And that, again, is why we included in the book people who we knew weren't going to agree with me.
I remember when Me Too happened. I mean, first you have this just recognition of this misery that's been going on behind closed doors. Sometimes not even behind closed doors. An open secret kind of thing. But I remember having a moment where I thought, you know what? Okay, so now people are open to maybe considering some of the propositions the Catholic Church has put forward. Of course, then Theodore McCarrick and the Pennsylvania grand jury report came out, and that sort of made me think, okay, maybe that won't happen. But there is something to be said for almost this common experience of the sexual revolution really messing things up, even in the church, even in the family. Not something that just people are doing at Woodstock or whatever it is. Is there sort of this solidarity, this common ground moment that could happen where, all of us have the experience of knowing someone in our family who killed themselves or someone near us, when I say some of this is obvious, in as much as we're always hearing about suicide, right? And so at some point, when someone says out loud, this is a problem, and let's consider what got us to this point and how we might get out of this point, I think that resonates with people.
I think some of the common explanations for our biggest problems are abstractions that are meant to deflect attention from the root cause. And you're bringing up Me Too makes me think of that, because like you, I thought, here is a moment where we could ask some questions about how could it possibly be that, these, all of these people who are probably the most sexually practiced generation in humanity have no understanding of the opposite sex. Young women who don't know not to go to their boss's hotel room in the middle of the night being one example. the licensing of predation. And the young women in these stories, and by the way, I'm not blaming victims, quite the opposite. I'm trying to understand why there were so many victims. Because the young women in these stories were mostly sophisticated graduates of our finest colleges and universities. They were working in the media, they were working in Hollywood, they're working in these elite venues. And yet, so many seem to be sent out into the world with no protective coloration. How could that be? I think part of the answer, again, is a lack of social learning. I read through hundreds of those stories at one point, and I kept thinking, what is missing? What is missing? And then I realized there were almost no mentions in these stories of a brother, an uncle, a father, a male figure to whom these young women turned before they found lawyers, to say, this guy is bothering me, or is this over the line, or anything like that. And similarly, reading the stories of the accused men, I felt something was missing. Didn't these guys have sisters? Didn't they have mothers? Didn't they have daughters? And then I realized a lot of them don't. I mean, a lot of the people in those stories and, in our own lives have not had that social learning of the opposite sex in the family that generations before us counted on, and that is probably pretty crucial to social and other survival. So it's a great paradox, because we live at a time when people think they know more about sex than any people who came before, and yet at the same time I think there's less understanding of the opposite sex for the reason that the petri dish that we used to learn it through has been crushed.
So how do we get out of this mess?
I mean, we have to call things by their right names is the first thing. So in the case of MeToo, for instance, that moment that we hoped for when, you could cross over and talk to people on the other side and say, look, this is a teachable moment, pretty quickly, people went back to the default ideology. So the problem is the patriarchy, right? The problem is mansplaining, the problem is oppression, etc. And that's what I mean about abstractions. I don't mean that there isn't bad behavior by men and false accusations by women and real oppression. Quite the contrary. But what I'm trying to do is distinguish those real things from this default move to say, well, now we know the problem is this abstract thing, as opposed to the problem is that we took, as a race of people, the wrong turn 50 plus years ago, and we need to figure out what to do about that. That second thing is a much harder thing to figure out than just complaining about the patriarchy.
Well, speaking of complaining about the patriarchy, we have this thing in our culture where, even comedy shows, the dad is always a dope. It's like we don't expect anything from men. How can we get to the point where women expect things from men? And where complementarity is like a real thing to people, where we make one another better.
In the 1970s, does anybody remember this? There was a novel called Been Down So Long It Looks Like Up to Me. I think that's where we are. And I don't know whether we will see it in our lifetimes, but I think there will be a realignment of the general public consensus about these things. And the example I always come back to, because I think it's really heartening, is tobacco smoking. Some of us, I can remember as a very little girl that you could smoke in hospital rooms. I don't know if anyone else here remembers that. As long as there weren't oxygen tanks present, you could smoke. I mean, not a 3-year-old, but, adults could smoke in hospital rooms. And there has been a phenomenal turnaround in that understanding. Now, how did it happen? I mean, how did this stuff that was destigmatized ever get re-stigmatized? It happened, with these people, first a few of them, who were, a real pain because They were trying to interrupt something that a lot of people enjoyed and who kept insisting, this is causing harm, this is causing harm. And over the course of decades and lawsuits, etc., they affected a major turnaround in public opinion about something that was once ubiquitous, that people thought had no moral content, and that was also prevalent across the Western world. That, I think, is the model that gives us hope, or one anyway.
You remind me, there's an old firing line with Bill Buckley, and he has Saul Alinsky on, and Alinsky's smoking during the TV show on PBS. It was quite the different world. Tell me about why you included the respondents in the book, because that's sort of an unusual thing to do. Come, criticize my book. Right in the book.
So we really, really wanted to start a conversation where none exists, as I said. And so it seemed to make sense to draw from different parts of the political spectrum. Rod Dreher was included. That was an obvious call because he has written and thought about many of these things from a different perspective and was guaranteed to take the argument seriously. Mark Lilla was also an obvious call. Mark, professor at Columbia, had written a book called The Once and Future Liberal, which was an attack on identity politics by a man of the left. And he caught a lot of flack for it. And in fact, it was watching the reaction to his book that made me first start thinking about writing this one, because it was clear that people were not arguing about identity politics the way they might argue about, industrial policy. There was something very different going on. It was exceedingly emotional, and he was ostracized by his side for that book, even though on everything else he is a man of the left in great standing. So I wanted to see what he would make of the argument in particular. And what he makes of it is pretty much, what you would expect of a liberal making sense of this argument, which is he does not want to talk about the sexual revolution. He makes a lot of interesting points. And then Peter Thiel, who is not entirely a libertarian, was included in the book in part because he had been in touch with me about how the West really lost God, and so he was already, engaging the broader thesis here. And so after a little back and forth, I suggested, why don't we take this, public, and you respond to Primal Screams. And so he has a critique as well. These are all short critiques, but there's a lot packed in them. And what he talks about is the importance of the demise of a living wage, in addition to the kind of trends that I'm talking about. So it's a friendly amendment kind of thing. And so again, our hope is that other people will pick up this book and feel like they can engage with the thesis without necessarily having to agree with every particular, because that's how a conversation gets started.
I hope you don't mind me asking a little bit about a different book, but in the context of this book. You mentioned Peter Thiel, and I can't help but think of our friend Father Arnie Panula, who died a number of years ago, because I really started paying attention to Peter Thiel when I heard Father Arnie and he were friends. They had a long friendship of sort of, I think, seeking, but also modeling how you have a conversation when you don't agree on everything, Does Father Arnie inform this book at all?
So do people know who we're talking about?
Probably not,
Yeah,
because
sorry.
it's a New York crowd.
Yeah. So for many years, one of the most dynamic priests in the D.C. area was an Opus Dei priest named Father Arnie Panula. He was the head of the Catholic Information Center in downtown D.C., and in that post, he drew people into him, into the CIC, into the church. He was very dynamic.
And also to give people a geographical picture, it's the Catholic Information Center is the closest tabernacle to the White House. It's about a stone's throw away from Lafayette Park, and so he's doing spiritual direction, as Father Charles now in his post now does for very high-ranking officials.
So he was a great friend to many and a great intellect, Harvard educated, and I ended up collecting our conversations as he was dying of cancer and turning those into a book. Now, as Kathryn mentions, he and Peter Thiel were friends for 30 plus years and obviously didn't see eye to eye on everything. But that, again, was an example of engaging people in conversation with, the hopes that you can do that even if you don't agree on everything. So does Father Arnie and his general approach inform this book? I would say yes, and I'm reminded of one of the things he said right before he died that's apposite here. We were talking about animals. And
Of course.
he said, if we ran the experiment on other species that we're running on ourselves, or if we ran on the natural world the experiment that we run on ourselves, that is like forcing people to live very differently from the way they're made to, he said there would be catastrophe and everybody could see it. So yes, I think that was the spirit of Father Arnie, and also this book might have appeared a year earlier if he had died on schedule, but instead
Right.
he diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and I told him I would write an essay about him, and then he just stayed in for months and months, and so I ended up having so many conversations that it became a book.
And it was really an example of, you had no question this was God asking you to do this, because he literally, I remember Mitch Boersma calling me from the CIC saying it's any day now that Father Arnie was going to die. And then 3 months later, he takes Amtrak to the Beckett Fund dinner in New York. It was like a resurrection experience. And during that time, you had these beautiful conversations. And I, in part, bring it up because if you haven't read the book, which is probably the case because I think DC people read the book, and maybe it didn't get much beyond, there's real practical wisdom in that book, and particularly for this time. And one of the blessings of him is that he had the high-ranking officials in his office, but young people were coming to him all the time. And so it's informed by all of that too, and it's really a beautiful and not long read. So thank you for doing that, because I know it did take time away from other things.
Wait, do I have time to tell them the story of how that book actually happened? So this is not a joke. I explained this in the introduction. Like 10 years before he died, I went into the CIC one day, and I had just written a eulogy for a friend. And Father Arnie said to me, "Hey, I like the way you write about your dead friends." He said, "Will you write about me when I die?" And I said, "Well, sure, but if I die first, you have to write about me." And that was a joke because I know he hated writing. And so he said, "Deal." And we joked about this for like 10 years. We called it the obituary pact. And then he got stage 4 cancer. So with days to live, we were told, I went over with my notebook and, recorded a conversation. And I thought, oh, that'll make a nice essay. And then he just didn't leave. So I started dropping by every week, and we finally ended up with like 14 of these conversations. And he laughed about it every time I would show up. And one of the last times he said, "I bet you're really sorry that you ever made that obituary pact." But I'm not sorry, because it is a beautiful book, because it is him talking. It is called The Last Homily.
The Catholic Information Center is the CIC. Sorry, we're doing the Washington thing of acronyms and abbreviations. That was really a beautiful book. So thank you for doing that. One question I wanted to ask you also was, if somebody just wandered in here from Bleecker Street on a Friday night, they probably just saw the title of the book. They might go, "Yeah, of course, Catholics talking about sex, Sex is the problem, you know. How do we get beyond? Because what is always striking to me is I suggested earlier by your books, it's this plea to humanity. It's not a conservative argument or a Catholic argument. It's look, you know, it's what the Sheen Center aims to do. You know, look at the truth, look at beauty, look at the human person. You know, look at the soul. Look at what's happening to people. How do we really get to that point where people will open the book and people will really engage?
Well, I think all the damage out there gives us something to work with, because deep down people know something is wrong. And there are people who are not going to be reached with data and, you know, just bang on argument. But I find in talking to people, and I'll give an example of this, that the things we talk about, the things the church teaches and stands for, can resonate in some unexpected ways. So, for example, I had a conversation a few years ago with two young women, very progressive, on elite, you know, campuses. And I said, what is the biggest problem that you face in, you know, your social life, or finding boyfriends or whatever? And they both said the same thing at the same time. They said, porn. And I said, really? And they said, yes, you never know when someone's looking at you, what he's looked at before. And then they both went on in this, you know, whole thing about it. Now, there is a case where the Catholic Church, and practically only the Catholic Church, stands against this thing. I mean, there is a case where the Catholic Church can connect with people who have no idea what else the church stands for. And, you know, in my limited encounters with priests, with men of the cloth, this is a point that I always make. Why aren't you up there talking about this every single Sunday? Because this is how you reach these young women who are averse to this thing and don't know any institution in the culture that's averse to this thing. So again, there's a lot of jujitsu that we can do, because the damage is considerable, and at some level a lot of people know it, including people who, you know, have never been, including people who are religiously illiterate through no fault of their own.
Just to underscore that porn point a little bit, priests often share that that this is like the number one issue that comes up in the confessional with men, and especially, and I always think, and those are the men who are going to confession. You know, like how deeply a part of the culture must it be that's the case. Just last night, I was a few blocks away from here, and there was this young girl who had to be no older than 23 or so, and she was advertising on her bag some kind of porn website, and she was talking with the guy she was with in the most graphic ways, and it was sort of betraying her anger and hurt in the course, and it's moments like that. On the obvious point, I just think, I mean, it seems so obvious, and yet it's not enough in so many circles to get us to the point where we do start shining the mirror and say, okay, what is this doing to us? But maybe your book will be a part. I think your book already is a part of helping us have the courage, because it takes a little courage.
Well, not to write, but there are signs of turnaround that I think are important. Kanye West's latest album, and what he has been saying in public, you know, you can discount it as performance art, but a lot of it, first of all, rings authentic. One of the things he talks about is his previous addiction to pornography and how it started when he was very young with a Playboy magazine that his father left out. He's also been very outspoken about what it was like to grow up mostly fatherless. I mean, he is talking about really gut-wrenching stuff. And whatever he intends, it has to be the case that is resonating with many millions of people out there because, again, of where we are, because of what we've done to ourselves and how big the problem is. So he is not the first one to come out of those kind of precincts and talk about this stuff. There are a couple of Hollywood actors who have done so. It's to be hoped there will be more. And that will open that conversation on the other side of the aisle for sure, I think.
I am definitely no expert on Kanye West, but I don't understand how asking the people working on your album to not have premarital sex could be a gimmick, you know? I mean, it does seem like it's coming from something that's stirring in him. My friend Charlie Camosi at Fordham University wrote a piece this week, and he just laid out the things that Kanye West has been saying that are true. You know, Jesus Christ is King. Wow, you know, that's the #1 album right now. And that's sort of a magnificent thing, whatever is actually going on in his heart. And, you know, I hope Christians are praying for him that this is true, and and if it's true too, and this is a transparent conversion that's happening, I mean, doing that so publicly, that's sort of dangerous territory. He's going to be a target for lots of spiritual warfare too. So I hope people pray for him. Anyway, I wanted to mention, I was telling you, Mary, that over the weekend I was talking with some of the Sisters of Life and some of New York's finest, you know, religious order that exists to help women who find themselves pregnant and need help. And they've saved so many lives. And anyway, one of the sisters was telling me that she's reading your book. And really thinks that you've totally gotten it. And this is a woman who has spent the last 25 years of her life with women in these desperate situations, you know, sometimes outside abortion clinics, that close, you know. But one of the things that she said that she's praying for, that with you shining a light on these things as you do, that it actually might like provoke some relief in it on the part of people who read it. Because if you're entrenched in this misery, you know, to finally know, wait, okay, there's a reason for this, and it predates me, and it predates my choices, and there almost is some freedom that this might allow. Do you feel that way?
I hope so. I mean, part of the point of the book is to get past the culture war calcification, right, in which one side is supposedly good, hectoring another side that's supposedly bad, and that's not how I see it. I think our predicament is actually worse than that. It is that, as you said, everybody's affected, right? Everybody's implicated, everybody's affected. If we can just get to a point where we acknowledge that, for starters, since it's everybody, we could talk about this potentially in a new way. That's the hope.
And I hope too, it's sort of as a reset button. We were joking, I was sharing a story that happened to me today where I'm speaking in some diocese, and there was this letter that I was supposed to get the cardinal or a priest or someone to sign that would essentially say that Kathryn Lopez is like free of sin. And I'm like laughing out loud because I cannot ask someone to sign this. I went to confession the other day. I have a reason to go to confession, right? And I hope too, stemming from what you were just saying, this is all an opportunity for us to say, look, we're all in this boat together, right? None of us is unscarred by all of this, whether by choices, by relationship, whatever it is. So that people understand we're on common ground here. You know, this is not us and them and others. This is us. You know. So with that, I want to open up to some questions. Yes.
Thank you very much. I appreciated the comment about the lack of social learning that you said, and also very much your comment about how do we get out of this mess. I am desperate. You know, this issue is so passionate for me. I'm 73 years old. I went to a Trinity school here in New York City when it was all male. We had sister schools, whether it was Spencer, Brearley, or Miss Hewitt's. We would have dances. And guess what? When boys and girls met, there was an immediate respect. And I don't mean Pollyanna. I know bad stuff happens, and it was the 60s and early 60s in this case, mid-60s. But the point is that we were taught to respect each other. Girls respecting us as men, young men, and we respecting girls as girls. I actually went to a dancing school here in Manhattan, Viola Wolf, and I'm not kidding you. This is, you know, a little 19th century, but we
we would bow to the girl before we asked her to dance. Now, I know this is another era. I also taught in an all-male school, went to an all-male college. It is an absolute tragedy. I see young people who do not know, girls and boys, do not have any clue who they are as girls or how to relate to boys or vice versa. And so, and there's a huge amount of pride. And I don't mean to get into speechifying. This is a question. But if we are not, you know, I mean, people who are in think tanks think, and writers write, and talk shows, and I'm a talk show, so, you know, I'm not condemning, I'm a writer, but they talk. At some point, we have to get into some kind of action, but we all expect someone else to do it. So to the question is, how do we get into some kind of action that teaches social learning, that actually starts to act, to do something to heal this? And can we face up to the fact that, you know, God had a certain order in mind in Genesis 1 through 3, and how do we get back to that without, you know, getting weird or however you...
I,
how do we get
Mary,
back to that?
immediately thought of our friend John Garvey, the president of Catholic University, my alma mater. When he got there, and I forget how many years ago it was, one of the first things he did is said, all right, co-ed dorms? What are you kidding me? And it was very controversial. But it gets to your point. It wasn't a nostalgia or a throwback. It's just sort of course correcting and trying to create a healthier environment where virtue might be something to consider.
Yeah, a backbone is in short supply, and John Garvey has it. That's a very good example. I mean, when leaders take the lead like that, they get admired for it. And so I am just a writer, not an activist. But to try and answer the question, first of all, do no harm, right? And a lot of what is in the public schools especially, and the private schools, is ideology that does harm, you know, that plays along with this confusion, this generalized confusion about what am I, who am I, and that normalizes it. And we need people to stand up to that, I think, on school boards and among educators, and finding them is going to be tough because there's a lot of cowardice out there.
But I also think building one another up in these little communities, whether it's the family or it's the school board, is really essential too. So people don't know, people know they are not alone. Your point, Mary, before about priests and talking about some of these issues from the pulpit, well, they have to know that there are people who want them to, right? Because sometimes I think they are afraid that if they go out there, you know, people are going to walk out. What the truth of the matter is, people want to know the truth. They want to hear the truth.
And I think that's our strongest suit.
Other questions? Yes, in the back there.
I was curious, when you said you talked to the priests and you said women were affected by pornography stories, going to mass my whole life, I've not heard one homily on pornography, or even, I can remember maybe 2 or 3 on even sexual ethics. Like, what were their reasons that they gave you that they were not doing that?
I didn't get any reasons, but I mean, I think in the big picture, the Catholic Church has made a few own goals lately that might, you know, make it a little harder to talk about these things. But so be it. I mean, they have to be talked about. It's these very teachings that are so rejected in our culture and by ourselves very often are lifelines to especially younger people in the culture. And I think the clergy has to understand and run with that, and so does the laity.
And I mean, they're part of our culture too, right? So I have heard priests explain, like, they'll never talk about moral questions about IVF or assisted reproduction because most of their parishes probably used it, say in New York City, and so that is some of it. But again, I think your book, Mary, is part of the solution, because I tell you this all the time, I'm always running into priests who, and young people and professors and people in all different walks of life who read your books, and they feel like they're less alone. They feel like they have an ally, and they also feel like they have something they can share with people. And I think when you do a book like this, you give other people encouragement and courage, and you create a community too. Because I mean, one of the things, and I often joke when people say, "Oh, how did you get the job you got?" I said, "Well, I have no other skills, so you got to make money some way." But the truth of the matter is that you're blessed to be able to write about true things and highlight good things that are going on. And so I think you've done something really, really important here, because it gives ammunition to people.
Well, thank you, but it's like my other work. It's mainly an act of listening. That's what I try to do. To the question of hope, there's a story that I think is helpful here, about how people are drawn in to the church. So I was giving a talk on a campus some time back, and this young woman came up and she wanted to share her story, and she said she was a convert. And that she had converted from nothing, no religious background. And I said, oh, what did it? Was it like philosophy? Was it, sacred art? Was it this, that? Again, stupidly going at it with abstractions. And she said, no, she said, I had a friend in high school, and she was from a big Catholic family. And I used to go to her house, and I just couldn't stay away from it. I just loved it so much. She said, I converted because I wanted what she had. And I think there's like enormous hunger out there for exactly that. And maybe it argues for, leading by the example of our families more than for, writing logical, it's to be hoped books. But, at this point, I just think we need to throw anything we have at this, because that is what people are looking for. And somewhere deep down, again, many of them know it. So I find that a hopeful story.
That is very, and it's so true. I've heard countless stories where the linchpin is, I want what she has, And I think your arguments in this book, your book, helps people who are doing that, because it's, it frankly can be a very frustrating thing to sort of draw people by relationship, right? It takes a long time. So if you see somebody and you they're longing for God, they're longing for peace, that whatever it is, it's not like you can give them a book and make it change overnight, or hit your hand on the table and tell them, well, darn it, this is what you have to do. It's a lot of love and example and sharing, and so again, thank you for helping that community. You encourage people who are doing this. So it's very important. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you for writing the book, Mary. You opened tonight by talking about what we're missing by not having a strong families, what our society is missing. When I was a child and I went to church on Mother's Day, Father's Day, the priest, no matter where I was, would give a long dissertation on how wonderful it was to be a mother, the good things about being a mother, the good things about being a father. Why doesn't the church, and I still nowadays when you go to church on Mother's Day, it's just want to honor all our mothers today, and that's it. Why doesn't the church talk about how wonderful the family is? Not necessarily the negatives about what happens in our society because we don't have intact families, but why it is so important to have intact families. What are the wonderful things about it, so that children can hear this and realize that this is a good thing? Why don't we get more support in that from the pulpit?
I can't speak for the priests, but I do think I understand at least one obstacle here, which is that as more and more kids come out of non-traditional families or anti-traditional families, the Catholic Church doesn't want to alienate them and doesn't want them, to feel bad listening to a homily about how great the natural family is when that is something essential that they don't have. And I see that as a conundrum, and I don't really have an answer to it, but I think I understand the hesitation in that case, as opposed to the hesitation to speak out about pornography and the brokenness of the sexual revolution and stuff. I mean, that I really expect they should be able to do, but in the case of this other problem, I think it's a little more understandable.
You mentioned in how the West really lost God, how even the image of the Holy Family doesn't resonate with a lot of people because of exactly what you just explained. I do think that there's a level, and this is another way where I think we can all be an encouragement to one another, including the priests. I mean, there's a spiritual component where, you may not grow up with a father in your household, but you are the child of a heavenly Father, right? And there's something that can be reparative there and healing there. And I think that's something that we need to tap into a little bit more. Also, I think Pope Francis is very helpful on this realm. He talks about the church as mother, and the church is a field hospital. And in the tradition of the Jesuits too, he talks very much about each individual person of the Trinity. Where again, there's a connection or a relationship that he's inviting you to. And I do pray that can help heal some of these wounds too, and help us move forward. Any other questions? Yes.
I think that, thank you again for the book, it was very insightful. However, I think that a lot of fear resonates within the church and the hierarchy. And with that fear, you can't teach the multitudes of people how to get the animals back in the barn. The door of the barn has been open and everyone is out. And unfortunately, if you don't have some form of, speaking from the pulpit, like so many people here have already said, regardless of the fear that we might have as a priest, to say this is right and this is wrong, and we can talk about it, it'll never happen. It will never happen. And the book, as I was reading the book, it brought me into some form of a fear of saying, wow, we've come this far. Is there ever a turning back?
Again, I am hopeful about that. Let me give you another example. In the past 2 weeks, I've met 2 different young people, one of whom became a Catholic convert from a not very religious background. The other of whom I think is going to. They don't know each other. One was at Yale, the other was at Columbia. And I asked each of them separately, so what did it? And their answer was, it was so toxic on campus. Like, people can see through the lies that they're told, even when they resist that. And it's my experience, and I bet Kathryn's too, that a lot of the young converts I can think of are coming into the church from, that battlefield exactly. It's not the 10 Commandments per se, maybe it is that they are connecting with, they're connecting the Catholic Church standing as a sign of contradiction with all of the lies out there that they know to be lies. So there's obviously work for everybody to do, but I think, again, in that very brokenness, there are things rising up, and connecting to the church because of it.
There's this program that's DC based called the Given Forum, where it's an annual program for young Catholic women, and the idea is to give them mentorship and make some connections, and they always have a project they need to work on, and it's just, I can't say enough about it. But so I've been involved as a speaker and a mentor and a spiritual director, and what was so striking to me is, so these are all, pious, faithful girls who go to Mass and go to Eucharistic adoration, and they are facing the same exact problems that everybody else is. And it's they were drawn to things like Eucharistic adoration because they didn't know what to do in this mess and how they could be good in this mess. And, guys expect certain things, and it's their faith that keeps them strong and gives them a joy in the midst of this. And so God is doing a lot of stuff, even in the midst of this mess. And I think it's important for us to know that, acknowledge that, and be confident in that. And the other thing, one thing that's beautiful hearing some of these questions is there's a real, I'm sensing love for the church and the priesthood, and even in this time of scandal. And one thing is striking to me is we're at the Sheen Center, of course, named after Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen. We're here in the Archdiocese where one of Cardinal Dolan's most colorful quotes is, "The day of the fat, balding Irish bishop is over." And so here we have two women on a stage talking about these issues that you could have two cardinals sitting here talking about, or two priests talking about. And so in that beautiful desire that I'm hearing for priests to talk about these things more, I actually think, Mary writing this book is so important, and in part because it will give the priests more courage and company, family even, but also, something that's always striking to me when people get ticked off at one bishop or another for not saying X, Y, or Z today to make everything change. We don't live in a culture where Cardinal Dolan saying X to Andrew Cuomo today will change the course of human history, right? We need a whole army of people doing this, and not just writing op-eds and making arguments, but just holding people's hands and being friends and showing them what they want, but that they don't know that they want. And so, again, in hearing so many of the frustrations and the beautiful desires for more people to tell the truth, I think there's a reflection there. Like, more of us doing this, I think will make a difference and help people understand, including priests, that they're not alone in saying, "Oh my goodness, what's going on in the culture? What's going on in the church?" Because they're actually, God's stirring a lot of good things in the world, even in the culture, even in the church. Kanye West, who would have known? One last question, or okay. I think we're wrap it up. We are about time, but we'll be around. And if everyone could stay seated as Mary leaves the stage, there will be books for purchase and signing in the back. So we just want to get Mary into that point. But first, please thank Mary for being here. Thank the Sheen Center for hosting for this, and I'm grateful to the National Review Institute as well. And thank you all for coming out tonight.